In this video, we're using a real-world example, McDonald's and an increase in the minimum wage, to explore why elasticities of demand are so important. We'll look at how a higher minimum wage affects the number of employees McDonald's wants to hire, and discuss the overall impact on employment. You'll learn how this depends on how responsive McDonald's demand for labor is, whether it's elastic or inelastic. By the end, you'll see how understanding elasticity helps us analyze real-world policies, like the minimum wage.
Right. The minimum wage is clearly the minimum that an employer has to pay their workers. In the state of Ohio, in the year 2022, it used to be something like $9.30 for that minimum wage. And then effective January 1st, 2023, they raised that minimum wage to $10.10. The minimum wage is a pretty contentious policy. Lots of folks are fighting for higher minimum wages. And so for many years, there's been this fight for $15, a $15 minimum wage. This has been going on in my memory since at least 2012 or something. And it's still not even close at the national level. Some states have a higher minimum wage, so California has a high one, and then cities can set their own minimum wages as well. So San Francisco has something like a $15 or $20 minimum wage in their city. On the cost side of raising the minimum wage, employers might argue that, well, we don't want to pay our workers that high minimum wage, and if we do so, if we have to pay them that high minimum wage, then we might cut back on those workers or fire those workers. So in a little bit of a provocative question down here, I have this motivation, how many workers will McDonald's fire if the minimum wage is increased? And so what I'm going to show you is that the answer to this question depends dramatically on how responsive demand curves for labor are for McDonald's. And in particular, it's going to be elasticity. That's what we mean by responsiveness. And that's going to be that's going to be the topic of this chapter. All right. So I'm going to draw on this graph, McDonald's demand for labor, and draw for you the minimum wage. We're going to have a price on the y-axis and quantity on the x-axis. Now, for a labor market, we're going to have the buyers of labor. McDonald's will be the buyer of labor. The seller will be the workers. They're going to sell their labor to the market. And so a demand for labor is going to be the firm deciding how many workers do they want to hire at a given wage. So the price in a labor market graph, this will be something like wage per hour over here on the price. And the quantity, you can think of this as employment in either number of employees or number of hours of work. So I'm going to give you two situations. McDonald's demand for labor could look something like that blue curve, relatively steep. Or it could be relatively flat. Okay. It can't be both of these at the same times. It's either going to be the blue curve or the red curve. So I want to think about what's going to be the situation in the world, these hypothetical worlds, if McDonald's labor looked like the flat red curve or if McDonald's labor looked like the steep blue curve. So where they cross, I'm going to say this is the initial minimum wage. Let's just say that's $9.80 for in Ohio. And McDonald's in Oxford hires something like 50 workers to start off with. Now say that Ohio is going to raise the minimum wage to $15. So that would raise that wage way up here to 15, a higher minimum wage that they would have to pay. So we can take that higher minimum wage over to both these curves. So on that blue curve, let's put a little dot where that $15 is, and we can come down and see the new quantity of workers that McDonald's and Oxford is going to hire. That's going to be something like 40. I'm just making up these numbers for an illustration. So if McDonald's and Oxford has that blue demand curve for labor, they're going to cut down the number of workers by 10. Okay, this is going to be they're going to fire workers essentially here, right? So if you raise the minimum wage, McDonald's is going to hire less workers because workers become more expensive. And we know from the demand chapter that if something gets more expensive, people want to buy less of it. Now, if the demand in Oxford from Oxford McDonald's is the red curve, we can take that price over to that point there, bring down the quantity, and let's say there'll be 15 workers. And so we can see for that red curve, that's a much bigger decline in employment. They're going to fire 35 workers, okay? And so the question is like, how many workers is McDonald's going to fire or get rid of is depending on whether they have that flat demand curve, red curve, or the steep demand curve for the effects of the minimum wage on employment, okay? So what we can see on that blue curve, we're going to say quantity not very responsive to price changes. And on the red curve, quantity very responsive to price changes. And what I mean by this, responsiveness in terms of quantity, the quantity change. So along that red curve, we have the same increase in price from $9.80 to $15, but we have a much bigger change in quantity for that red curve, so very responsive. Right? On the blue curve, same increase in price from $9.80 to $15, but we have a much smaller change in that quantity demanded of workers. Okay. This chapter is all about that responsiveness to a price change. And so if it's very responsive like the red curve, that'll be something that we'll label more elastic. And if it's not very responsive like the blue curve, we're going to call that inelastic. Like so. And I'll go into more definitions of that in later videos. But this, I wanted to give you a motivation of why we might care about these elasticities that we'll talk about for the rest of this chapter.